Good morning, everyone. My name is Aaron Blumberg, and I am Swiftland's Continuing Education Coordinator, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to H is for Hidden Barriers, Workplace Success Through Inclusion. We have a wonderful learning opportunity ready for you this morning with Mary Martinez. Mary Martinez is the president of Inclusion Focus LLC and has more than 25 years of experience as an HR leader and consultant in diversity and inclusion, talent and organization development, and employee engagement. She has held corporate roles for Cigna, Honeywell, Sanofi, and Alcatel-Lucent, and has been a senior consultant and practice leader for ORC Mercer and APT Metrics. Mary has implemented a wide range of diversity and talent initiatives in businesses, not-for-profit and government organizations, helping them to develop measurable diversity and inclusion strategies based on their vision for inclusion and particular organization goals. A frequent contributor to D&I publications and conferences, Mary is currently the Education Co-Chair for the South Florida Diversity Council and Diversity and Inclusion Director for the Greater Miami Society for Human Resources Management. She holds an MBA in Organization Behavior from Bernard M. Baruch College, a City University of New York. Please welcome Mary and enjoy her webinar this morning. Mary?
Thank you, Aaron, and good morning to everybody on the phone and on our webinar. It's just a real pleasure to be here doing my second webinar for the Southwest Florida Library Network. Today's webinar takes a look at diversity and inclusion from the perspective of creating a workplace that enables all employees and the organization to be successful. Particularly, we'll be considering ways to make talent decisions more inclusive. We'll be talking about two approaches to creating greater inclusion in the workplace. First, changing individual behaviors, and second, modifying policies, processes, and practices, with an emphasis on that second approach. So let's take a look at what we're going to be covering. Our topics today include: why does inclusion matter? What are the factors that diminish inclusion or increase inclusion? And then, most importantly, how can organizations make the workplace more inclusive through how they manage talent? So let's start out just with some baseline setting and make sure we're all on the same page about some definitions. So when we talk about diversity and inclusion in groups and organizations, what are we talking about? Let's try to define inclusion first. If you would participate with me by typing some phrases into your chat boxes, I would like to see what you would say inclusion is. So write me a couple of words that describe what inclusion is in an organization. And Aaron, if you can help me, I'm not able to see yet what's popping up here. Although I see that,
They're still typing.
yeah, a couple of folks are typing. Here we go. Great answers. All right. So thank you, Emily. Inclusion means making sure that your workplace is accessible to your employees in both social and physical ways. I like that definition, Emily. Thank you. And I know someone else was typing. Well, what I'm also going to ask you, and I usually ask this first actually, is what do you think diversity is? Because I like to contrast those two things. So if you haven't responded yet around inclusion, maybe you'd like to put a couple words about diversity in the chat box, please. I have to say, I can't wait to be in Fort Myers next month and be able to speak with you directly and not have to be relying on chat boxes. This is, it works, but it's so much nicer to have you there in person. Great. Okay, so thank you, Renita. She writes, diversity is a mix of people from different backgrounds. Absolutely perfect. Thank you. So if we start out with that definition of diversity, because that's kind of the basic starting point. It's exactly what Anita said. It's the collective mixture of individual differences and similarities. We often forget about that. And then inclusion is a bit different. That is creating that environment that Emily mentioned earlier, where everyone feels accepted and valued and able to contribute, not in spite of their differences, but because of them. So their differences are really valued. And then I'm going to share one other definition with you, and that is intercultural competence. And if you've been on my earlier webinar, you might have heard me talk about this. But intercultural competence enables us to get from having diversity to being inclusive. And I'm just going to show you the definition for that. And it is the capability to shift cultural perspective and appropriately adapt your behavior to cultural differences and commonalities. Essentially, it allows us to bridge between cultures. We don't necessarily, and we often, most usually don't, change our own values or ways of looking at the world, but we're able to step over the little bridge that you see here and understand perhaps why the puzzle piece that's being held out by the second person is shaped the way it is, because we can understand that individual's worldview. So having intercultural or cultural competence is really important for creating an environment of inclusion. And thank you for those of you who contributed definitions. So let's talk a little bit about why inclusion matters. And I know that many of you are very aware of the reasons and are using them as really your business case for doing things in your own libraries. And I'm going to start out actually talking about libraries in the context of inclusion and referring to some of the things that I have been able to learn are going on within the ALA and also within various individual libraries and your network. So the first thing that I took a look at was the American Library Association Strategic Directions for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. You may be familiar with these. I've put on this particular slide a summary. And in case you haven't seen it or looked at it recently, it says, the American Library Association recognizes that equity, diversity, and inclusion aspects of work among the members of the association within the field of librarianship and within the communities served by libraries. This work includes addressing, dismantling, and transforming policies, structures, and biases throughout the organization and the field of librarianship. ALA, through its actions and those of its members, is instrumental in creating a more equitable, diverse, and inclusive society. And there are a couple of ways that they've been working on this, and again, you may be familiar with them. You'll see that I've included a screenshot in the lower right-hand corner of the slide. That is the ALA Office of Diversity homepage. And you'll see listed there some of the initiative that they have launched, some of them a while ago, some of them more recently, and they include the Diversity Counts. I'd call it a project. It began in 2006, and the effort there is to track the demographic trends within the librarian profession. The profession also has ethnic caucuses, attempting to both give support to people of color and those who are in the non-dominant groups within the librarian profession, and also to hear their voices. And then there's also an ALA scholarship program, which encourages those who are in minority groups to come into the profession. And these efforts are driven by the reality of the demographic contrast between the library users and the profession. And it was really interesting. Aaron passed me an article just a day or so ago, and it looked back in the history of libraries attempting to increase diversity. And its statement was that although this was first initiated about 16 years ago as a real push within the library system, really there has not been a tremendous amount of change between then and now. So, as you're probably well aware, although your individual library may differ, the library profession overall is still largely made up of white females, and it hasn't changed all that much over the years. But there is a desire for diversity to both mirror and serve the customer base better and to provide creativity and innovation within libraries. And so I'm sure this data that you're looking at on this slide is no surprise to you. I do think your individual libraries may look a little different. The largest number of minorities actually are found in public libraries. So many of you may be from an organization of that sort on the call today. The bottom line is, however, that the gap between the racial and ethnic profile of the population of the U.S. as a whole and what would be a corresponding representation of librarians remains huge. And the chart here uses the percentages of each racial ethnic group from 2013 to project how many librarians there would need to be to match that percentage, so to get parity between our U.S. population and the librarian profession. And it then compares that number to the actual number to get the difference or the gap that you'll see in the far right-hand corner where I have a red arrow pointing down. This type of projection explains why the ALA has put in place the programs we just mentioned. And if you want to take a look at more of this data and read more from this author, her name is Chris Borg. She's actually the director of libraries for MIT, and this came from an article titled "The Unbearable Whiteness of Librarianship," which some may recognize as a takeoff on the unbearable lightness of being. And she has a little blog called The Feral Librarian, so that may be of interest to you. Well, let's take a look at a couple more things that are contributing to the challenge in increasing diversity in the librarian population itself. So here's a couple of other challenges and opportunities. As I noted, most my librarians who are minorities work in public libraries. Another factor that's going on is that there's a graying of the librarian population. As an industry, there will be an exiting of older staff in large numbers in the coming years, really without there being sufficient young talent to replace them. In addition, younger librarians are more likely to leave their library positions. Those under 45 make up about 30% of the profession, but 44% of the leavers come from this age group. And this data is a little bit old, but from my reading of various articles that I've cited here in the references, I would say that that trend has just continued. Finally, is there a bright spot of any sort? Well, I think this might be one. Non-credentialed staff are more diverse than credentialed librarians. And when we talk about credentialed librarians, we're talking about those who have a master's in library science. And this may be a positive in the sense that we also see, and we can read in the research, that the types of jobs that are happening in our libraries are changing. So different qualifications may be required, and there may be opportunities to bring in more diversity to the library systems. There are some specific reasons why library organizations need to be inclusive, but there's also some generic reasons that apply to all organizations. So I'd like to take a look at a couple of those. So what you're looking at here, and I hope you can see it okay, is the most recent data from a Society for Human Resources Management study of satisfaction at work. And it looked at satisfaction from several dimensions. And you'll see in the very top layer of data there that it revealed that 65% of all employees who participated believe that respectful treatment of all employees is very important to their job satisfaction. You also see on the left-hand side where the green circle is that only 38% felt that this was actually happening. So they were very satisfied, only 38%. The other piece of data I wanted to point out to you on this is found in the third row down, and that shows that trust was very important for 61% of respondents. So that's in the red circle at the right. However, again, note the green circle at the left. Only 33% of respondents said that trust between employees and senior management was very satisfying to them within their workplaces. And importantly, both respect and trust are key elements of inclusion. So inclusion creates a workplace of greater employee satisfaction, which of course means greater commitment, higher performance, and higher likelihood of retention. I thought we'd just do a little quiz here. And I have a couple of questions that have to do with engagement and how that impacts performance and satisfaction at work. So if you would, take a look at these questions and we can do them one at a time. We'll do number 1. So choose one of the percentages from the right-hand side of this page. The percentages are not currently lined up with the right answer to each one of the questions. And type in your chat box, what percentage of employees do you think are engaged at work? And as we know, this is something that's constantly being surveyed, especially by Gallup. And by engaged at work, they mean involved in, enthusiastic about, and committed to their work and the workplace. So anyone who would like to give a guess, just type that in your chat box for us. Okay, I got 38. Thank you, Anita. You're very close, which should give everyone else a clue. It's actually 35. So only 35% of employees are engaged at work. And you'll see some data later, and there has been research that points to lack of inclusion as one of the reasons why this is true. Let's try number 2. Highly engaged employees are what percent more likely to have above average productivity? This came from the Workplace Research Foundation. I think I've got one person who's going to give me an answer here. Okay, so we've got a 38 and a 48. In this case, it is actually 38. Right answer. All right. So only 38%, highly engaged employees are 38% likely to have above average productivity. So it makes quite a difference. If you can imagine that an employee was offering almost 40% more of what they're bringing to work to accomplish the tasks that are in front of them. In today's workplace, where everyone has a higher workload than they really feel like they can handle, if employees are highly engaged, they'll be tackling that a lot more than they will if they are not engaged. So let's try number 3. The percentage of employees that said they would work harder if their efforts were better recognized. It should get easier. You have less choices. Okay, that is it, 69. 69% of employees said they would work harder if their efforts were better recognized. I think that's incredibly important. That's another Gallup survey finding. You'll see when I go over a couple of the reasons why people do not feel included that one of them is not being recognized. All right, so interestingly, engagement also improves quality of work and health. So there has been a study that showed higher scoring business units report what percentage fewer of safety incidents. So engagement reduces accidents in the workplace. Yes, and as I said, it will get easier as we go along. It's 48% fewer safety incidents. Very impressive. And then finally, this may be a fact that's pretty familiar to you, but if you think about the idea of people becoming disengaged and ultimately potentially leaving the organization, you have to think about what the cost is. And when they do these estimates, they do it based on not only the fact that you may need to pay a recruiter, but also the time that's spent by those who need to do the recruiting, those who have to perhaps stay overtime to fill in for the employee who isn't there any longer, and the time for the new employee to get up to speed. So if you add that all up, and obviously we only have one answer left here, it comes out to 150% of salary. So just from a business point of view, it's very expensive when employees are not engaged and don't want to stay. Thank you for participating in this. I appreciate it. And pulling this all together is a fact that comes from a study by Sirota. Sirota is one of the largest employee survey houses. They've done this for many, many years. And they're interested in and have done some research on how inclusion relates to some of these other things that we're trying to achieve in the workplace. So they have determined that inclusive organizations have the highest employee engagement, which in turn leads to higher performance and productivity. So it's not just us saying, well, it would make sense if this were true. It actually has been discovered through research. Just to take a quick look at, so how does this happen? What leads to what, in a sense? So if we think about the idea that if we have employees who are valued and respected for their skills, in that far left-hand box, they know that their ideas are going to be welcomed. And they also know that they're respected in terms of who they are and able to come to work and be that person. That means they're going to be much more engaged in their work, and they're committed to the goals of the team and the organization. That leads to the organization having high levels of performance and satisfaction and retention, as we just saw from the Sirota survey. That, in turn, leads to efficiency, innovation, and customer service thrives. You can really think of this as a circle, what they often call a virtuous circle. So if employees feel valued, ultimately customers are better served. And if we want to look at it linearly, we can see that we're moving from an environment which offers inclusion to one that includes engagement and commitment stemming from that inclusion, and then delivers excellent customer service. And I think this model fits quite well for libraries. Oops. Forgive me, I went the wrong direction there. Let's keep going. All right. So now that we know what some of the reasons are to be concerned about inclusion, let's talk about what factors either decrease or increase it. So let's talk about exclusion and what might decrease people feeling a part of the organization first. So there was a study conducted actually in 2008 by several of the leading recruitment agencies. It included CareerBuilder, Kelly Services, and Harris Interactive. And when they did this study, it showed that 23% of diverse workers said they had been discriminated against or treated unfairly in the workplace based on their background. This can take many forms. Most of them are not strictly illegal discrimination. So it's something that we really need to think about. But especially when we see that 30% said it happens at least once a week. So let's go through what some of those experiences that people were having, which they saw as excluding them. So not receiving credit for one's work, 48% said that was an issue. Not having concerns addressed or taken seriously, 42% cited that. Having coworkers talking behind their back, 33%. Being overlooked for a promotion, 32%. Not being assigned to projects that will help the worker gain more visibility in the company, 32%. Having coworkers say derogatory comments to or in front of the worker, 31%. And feeling ideas or input are not paid attention to or generally ignored, 30%. And if you can turn these around, you can see what managers need to do in order to make people feel valued. I wanted to talk about one other aspect of inclusion. Let's look at a more recent report that was based on some research done by Deloitte and its Diversity Leadership Center. It's related to the concept of covering. This idea was talked about, in my experience, in the 90s, but it was a term used largely by the gay community, and often it was referred to as bearding, which meant developing a persona for the workplace that made one appear to be straight. So you would put pictures of the opposite sex spouse or partner on your desk, and you would change the pronouns when you came in after the weekend to talk about what you did. You might even invite someone who was not your spouse or partner, but who was of the opposite sex to company events. Well, this term covering really is a lot like that, but it's much broader. It was originated in 1963 by a gentleman whose name is Irving Goffman, and he coined the term covering, which he says describes how even individuals with known stigmatized identities, so that, in other words, something you can't cover up, make a great effort to keep that stigma from looming large. So if you are a person of color, which is obvious to everyone, you may do things to, in other words, play that down. But it turns out it actually applies to any individual who feels that there are negative stereotypes attached to some aspect of their identity. And in 2006, a gentleman whose name is Kenji Yoshino expanded the concept by identifying 4 axes along which individuals can cover. And those have to do with appearance. So, for example, and I'm only using an example here, but if I were an African American woman, I might be hesitant to wear my hair natural in some settings because I don't want to call attention to my appearance as being associated with my race. There's also affiliation. So that might be that I don't make comments that link me to the group that I would rather not have emphasized as being one of my affinities. Advocacy, where I would actually speak out for that group if someone else is perhaps saying something negative or not supporting the group, I may not chime in because I don't want to identify myself or have the spotlight cast on me. And then finally, association. I may not want to hang out with those at work who are most like me, just because I feel that reinforces any stereotypes that people may have about the group. Well, it turned out in the Deloitte study that 61% of employees indicated that they covered on at least one of these axes. Okay, and on the right-hand side, where the green circles are, you'll see what percentage of various groups do this. So up at the very top, LGBTQ individuals, 83% of them in the Deloitte study said that they cover on one or more axes. 79% of blacks, 67% women of color, 66% women, 63% of Hispanics, and very interestingly, 45% of straight white men cover. And you might wonder, why might that be? But if you think about it, in many organizations, and I'm speaking largely probably of the corporate environment, but men may not want people to know that the reason they're leaving early is to go to one of their children's events. It may be seen actually in 2 different ways if they're going to coach their son's baseball team or they're going to coach their daughter's soccer team. But certain things they just may not want to be known. For example, that they at one point in their career took time off for parental duties. Maybe they actually spent a year or so being the at-home parent. In many organizations, this is still a stigma on one's career and gives the idea that you're not serious about advancing in the organization. So there are reasons why straight white males may cover. So what are the impacts of covering? Well, first of all, it just takes up an enormous amount of energy. And of course, that also draws up the energy and the focus that the employee can apply to the tasks that are part of their job. And it has some other profound effects. It's really detrimental to sense of self. In this survey, this issue was expressed by 60 to 70 plus of respondents in the survey, depending on the category of covering that we're talking about. It also leads to the perception of lack of opportunities because people have a feeling they don't fit the mold. So of the 53% in the survey who said leaders expect employees to cover, 51% said this is somewhat to extremely affected their perception of their opportunities. And finally, it leads to a decrease in commitment. 51% said this somewhat to extremely affected their commitment. So half of those who were surveyed. What are the underlying causes of exclusion? Let's talk about this a little bit. Well, one that's really the foundation is organization culture that oftentimes is based on the dominant group beliefs and behavior. Another aspect of this is that there are unwritten rules that disadvantage some groups and individuals. At the same time, these things are less obvious, but there may be formal policies and practices that reflect the same monocultural worldview. Often, there's a lack of awareness and a lack of knowledge of different cultures and worldviews. And from this come stereotypes and assumptions, which factor into how people are treated. And that is also related to the idea of unconscious biases, ones that we don't even know about, which are influencing our decisions that we make about people every single day. And of course, that also ties back to cultural competence. So all of those things can be underlying causes of exclusion. But let's take a look at this from a more positive perspective. What makes employees feel included? And for this, I'm going to draw upon some of the things that your network is doing. First of all, diversity and inclusion is an explicit organization value. And I think you'll probably recognize the logo on the upper right-hand side, which says Embrace Diversity. And I got this from the Southwest Florida Library Network. Secondly, leaders talk frequently about the importance of diversity and inclusion, and they model inclusion with the way they interact with their staff directly, and also if they're doing, for example, a town hall or having a webinar, to make sure that they take questions and provide answers and engage in dialogue with everyone in the organization. In an inclusive organization, policies and programs recognize and support diversity. They're also transparent to employees. So there's no hidden agenda, and the unwritten rules become, to the best possible point, written, so that everybody knows how things work. And for that, I just wanted to include this little orange box, which I also found on the website, announcing that the Southwest Florida Network has started captioning its webinars. And that happened this March. And that demonstrates to people that the network is and wants to be more inclusive, as does the fact that we have someone on this webinar translating for us. All right, so then what else? Well, the workplace environment is one of respect and openness to difference, so employees can feel that they're bringing their whole selves to work. A couple other things. Recognition. We mentioned this early on as something that can either engage people or discourage them. And here I've just picked up a picture of someone from the network website who has been recognized and honored. And there are frequent opportunities for input and feedback. And also people can see that that's being acted upon. So in other words, there are meetings, there are team meetings, there are library meetings, there are surveys, and lots and lots of different ways that people can voice their thoughts and their opinions. And then certain things are done to change the environment, and wise leaders will point back and say, you told us that we should do this, and now we're putting in this program. Also, there's organization support for what we could call affinity-based employee groups. In many organizations today, these are called business resource groups or employee networks, but they're built around some affinity or diversity dimension that people share. I don't know how well this applies in your library network, but in many organizations, this is really beneficial for both the employees and the organization. They often provide mentoring and career support, and they help to develop business solutions that are based on their cultural insights. Finally, organization support for diversity in the community, something I know that your libraries are doing. And again, I pulled this from the network newsletter, I believe, about an experience of one of your counties with an amazing 3D printer. And just looking at the picture, you know that you're touching lots of different people from your community, and it demonstrates the inclusion that the library wants to achieve. Okay, so let's go to the next key part of our discussion. How can we create this culture of inclusion? Before I tell you some ideas, though, I would like to get some thoughts from you. In your chat box, just type me around the idea of managing people, and that includes recruiting them and moving them forward in the organization. What would you say are your biggest people challenges as they relate to diversity and inclusion? Just within your own library. I'd like to get a couple of ideas from you. These will help me not only as I speak to you today, but also as I think about additional webinars that I can work with Erin to provide to the network. And Erin, I'm hoping maybe we can keep a list of some of these, and we will try to make sure, if I'm not speaking about it today, that we get to it in future learning sessions. All right, that's a good one. Emily mentions the digital divide. Some patrons don't have training on the basics of computer use. Okay, so that obviously affects your, I'll call them clients, but it also means changes in the skills and abilities that you need inside your libraries, right? So you need to look for people who can help bridge this gap. Right. So you're needing new skills in your library, and at the same time you're also looking for diversity. So that makes quite a challenge. Given what I've seen, especially about the number of people who are signing up for being in the library profession, but not necessarily staying in it. There are still quite a few people applying to library schools from the data that I've seen, but when people come into these positions, they do tend to eventually, in a relatively short time, go somewhere else. So, all right, well, definitely to keep that one in mind. And I'm going to go on now, and we'll talk a little bit about the talent aspect of diversity and inclusion. So making the workplace more inclusive through what I call talent management, really removing the barriers and the biases. So I talk HR speak sometimes. That's human resources speak. So I want to make sure that we're all on the same page with regard to terminology. So talent management includes all the processes that are related to recruitment and hiring, development and advancement, and retention. And for each one of these, what we want to start asking ourselves is, where are the barriers to inclusion? And we can look at a variety of kinds of data to determine this. We can ask some additional questions like, Who succeeds in this organization? Where do careers of certain groups get stalled? Who's leaving? Do we know why? Surfacing and critically examining these barriers requires more than just looking at representation numbers or even looking at engagement survey results if we're only looking at the numbers. It often takes additional research. And this can be done through interviews or focus groups, sometimes by an external neutral resource, and also by offering multiple opportunities for honest dialogue across subgroups in the organization. Some leaders just very frequently do a breakfast with the, and in your case, breakfast with the library director, or something of that sort, that gives people an opportunity in an informal setting to have a real dialogue. And then once the specific challenges for your organization have been identified, then you can focus on the processes that are potentially creating the barriers. And some examples might be the way in which competencies are being defined, what the qualifications are for jobs, how candidates for positions are sourced, screened, interviewed, and finally selected. And there might also be barriers in the process used to determine promotions, or who's on a list to succeed people in key positions. And I'm going to give you some information now to go over why these are the places that we need to look and what the impact can be if there are biases in some of these systems and practices. First, I want to talk about this idea that research has suggested that different barriers are more or less important in blocking certain groups from advancing. So organizations need to address the specific challenges faced by each group, which really points back to what I was just talking about in terms of needing to do the background research, because not the same barrier will affect everyone. I was one of the researchers behind a study done in 2009 that produced the results that you see here. We looked at the barriers facing minorities and women in leadership pools. We also included in this study what we call non-headquarters nationals because it was a global study. But here I'm just showing you the results from minorities and women. And we used the term minorities even though it was a global survey and simply asked the various countries to consider minorities to be whatever groups were not in the dominant group in the workplace and who might have barriers that they were facing in terms of their career development. So note that, looking at this data and starting at the top, that some of the same barriers apply to both women and minorities. Looking at the first one, exclusion from informal networks is one of those. Other barriers affect the two groups differently. So we move down, we can see that having a different leadership style is a bigger potential issue for women than it is for minorities. Whereas visibility to senior leadership looks like it's slightly more of a barrier for minorities than it is for women. The respondents in our survey who were HR and diversity staff indicated that women were most affected, in fact the only ones really affected significantly, by work-life friendly policies and practices. And then if we look at the next three categories, all of these appear to affect minorities to a greater degree, and they are managers' unwillingness to take a risk on non-traditional candidates, being subject to more direct bias, and the difficulty of these individuals in finding powerful mentors. The study also found that the unwillingness of managers to take a risk on non-traditional candidates correlated with lower representation of both women and minorities. The common element that underlies many of the barriers that our systems create is bias, sometimes conscious, sometimes unconscious, but always built on a failure to look beyond our past assumptions or to apply more rigorous and less subjective criteria. So bias is not really the subject of this webinar, and if I can pause for a little commercial, it is something I will be talking about next month when I deliver a workshop. But let's take a 50,000-foot look at why bias is such a prevalent part of the decision-making process, no matter what that process is. I'm going to look at a couple of them, actually. First of all, in general, how do biases affect our decision making, including those about talent? Well, there is a human need for generalizations. And sometimes this prompts their less positive cousins, stereotypes, and assumptions. But generalizations are necessary for us to operate as humans. If we had to reassess each situation that we met and its relevant data using our conscious minds, we would be paralyzed. And the reason for this is that our brain's ability to process the huge amount of data is not there. We receive approximately 11 million bits of data versus being able to process 50 bits per second. So our senses feed us 11 million bits, and our conscious brain can cope with only about 50 bits per second. One researcher sums up the problem like this. It now appears that the vast majority of processing is accomplished outside conscious notice, and that most of the body's activities take place outside direct conscious control. This practice suggests that practice and habit are important because they train circuits in the brain to carry out some actions automatically without conscious interference. And that's what's going on when we experience unconscious bias. Have you ever heard the statistic about the time it takes to make a judgment about someone we meet? It's been proven that in 7 seconds we make 11 judgments about that individual. And that was proven by a study done by Solomon at NYU. Another phenomenon that affects the rapidity of unconscious brain is our quick development of affinity with others who share our key diversity dimensions. We're attracted naturally to those who are like us, and we quickly form groups with like individuals. The problem is that this tendency for our biases to kick in occurs in every kind of people decision that we make. Sourcing, selection, performance management, coaching and development, promotion and succession planning, engagement and retention, conflict management, and even the application of HR policies on each individual basis when it's not done consistently. So let's look at some examples. This may be a bit small on your screen, but I'm going to point out some findings from this survey that was actually done by Catalyst. And what it's shown is that the biases are built into the concepts that many people have of what leadership or management behaviors should look like. In this case, the study looked at gender biases. So, characteristics of leaders that were described most frequently and by a large percentage of the respondents to this survey, both male and female, have been identified as stereotypes of men, okay? And I'm going to call up the first 3 here. See the first 3 bars in the chart? They are, if you cannot read it, action-oriented, drives results, and problem-solving. And granted, these are followed by 2 that are generally seen as female, collaborative and visionary, and a 3rd, which is inclusion, which is seen as neutral. However, if you go down to the next 2, which I don't have highlighted, you'll see that assertive and decisive come up again, which are seen as male traits. In addition, the Catalyst study found that stereotypically male characteristics also appeared more frequently in formal job descriptions of senior executive roles. So they're found in the competencies, and you can see not only did people choose male characteristics more frequently, they chose them by quite a wide margin if you look at the difference between the top 3 bars, the next 2 bars, and then some of the additional female-oriented traits that are found lower in the chart. And just in case you're wondering, there was a separate study that identified which traits were stereotypically male and which ones were stereotypically female. While this gender research was focused on the gender bias, the preferences that were uncovered have implications for advancement of other non-minority groups, including racial ethnic minorities, GLBTQ individuals, and people with disabilities. Research of this sort has caused some organizations to focus on broader types of criteria for identifying performance, well, the potential, and evaluating performance. Things like emotional intelligence and learning agility. They are also moving away from judgments that are based on a candidate's having served in a very strictly defined progression of jobs. As the Catalyst study suggests, job descriptions and competencies that are developed with inherent biases get used then for recruitment, and then the same biases are built into the downstream processes like identification of high potential talent, leadership development, etc. However, that's not the only way that bias creeps in to the selection process. Some of you may have seen this study that was done quite recently. There is a strong evidence that bias in hiring begins at the very first resume screen. So, a study that was conducted by researchers at the University of Missouri showed that when they circulated resumes with exactly the same qualifications but different names, some that were interpreted and sounded white and some that sounded African American, and they were submitted, these resumes were put out through the mail or email through various, in response to various newspaper ads, to the same employers in Boston and the Chicago job markets. What happened was that those with the white names were 50% more likely to get callbacks for interviews. And these findings were consistent across industry, occupation, and the size of the company. And just to sort of note that it's not only about the name, which was used as the research tool here. Another study conducted in 2010 by Stanford University, and it's referred to as the invisible hand, demonstrates the existence of racial bias without using the naming approach. So in this research, they put an iPad being sold online in a picture online, either being held by a white hand or in the other offer by a black hand. And they found that the iPad held by black hands got 13 fewer responses and 17 fewer offers. And while it's disheartening to consider, we can see that race still carries with it prejudices. Perhaps in this case it was about the reliability of the seller or how the iPad might have been treated, all based on stereotypes or at least discomfort on the part of some of the buyers with an African American seller. Another example of how biases can play a role in people's decisions comes around this question of fit. And one study that was done on hiring practices showed that 70% of respondents identified personality or attitude and institutional fit as very important criteria for selection. I'm wondering what you think enthusiasm, which was one of the things that was mentioned as the 3 top characteristics, intelligence, enthusiasm, and cooperativeness. How would you define enthusiasm? What behaviors would you look at to see if someone was enthusiastic? And if you type that in, and meanwhile, I'm going to take a look at some of the things that I see are already typed here, and perhaps I can respond to them. So what do you look for in someone who's enthusiastic? You may notice that this came from a study that was done within libraries, from that site that's below. Okay, so we've got a couple of ideas here. Anita says, when someone asks for new challenges or has suggestions on how to do something differently. So being proactive in asking for assignments and work and speaking up with a suggestion about how to do things differently. And those are, very much a part of what we understand, particularly from a Northern European-based culture, or that is also applying to the U.S. in large measure, but it may not apply across cultures. So what the problem is with characteristics such as enthusiasm or even cooperativeness, they may be seen and acted upon very differently across cultures. If I am from an Asian culture, I may not feel it's appropriate for me to in any way challenge my manager by putting forth a new idea on how to do something. And I may feel that I simply do my job and I wait for someone to recognize my expertise and give me my next assignment. So while we may think that we have a fair and an objective way to assess something like enthusiasm, if we think of it from a cross-cultural perspective, we may find that we're actually creating a barrier to some individuals in the work environment. And I see a couple more comments here. Yes, so Emily also stated that it's someone who has a lot of new ideas beyond their specific job duties. And again, we can recognize that those from different cultures may have those ideas, but they may be more or less comfortable putting them forth, or they may put them forth in different kinds of ways. So we need to be very conscious of the cultural bias that we can build into our evaluation characteristics. In fact, one study that I read about that was conducted in professional services suggests that this idea of fit can sometimes end up meaning simply which candidate has the same hobbies, background, educational experience as I do, and I'd really like to hang out with that individual. So if we're not careful, the conversation kind of devolves to what is most comfortable. And that's why we want to catch that word fit when we're having a discussion about selecting people for whether it's a job or an assignment or doing a performance appraisal for that matter, to talk about fit. And there are some other kind of code words that we use sometimes too. When we can't really be objective, we just have a feeling about the individual. And that's where we're starting to get into trouble, because the subjectivity can come in. So I want to look at another area that can also be subjective, as proven by some studies, and that is assessment. And what I'm going to look at here is actually performance assessment. So performance assessment, I believe, is particularly important because it has an impact on a person's total career. For most organizations, potential to move up consists of two elements: having exceptional performance in your current role, which then convinces people that you can do larger roles, right? So this means that performance has far-reaching implications for your career prospects. And like other assessments, performance appraisal is also open to bias. So a study conducted by Stanford's Clayman Institute for Gender Research has found that men and women are assessed differently at work. Managers are significantly more likely to critique female employees for coming on too strong, and their accomplishments are more likely than men's to be seen as a result of their team rather than individual efforts. Taking a look at some other findings from the same study, it found that about half as many references were found in women's performance appraisals about their having vision. About half of the women as men received as many references to their technical expertise, and only 1/3 as many women got as much feedback linked to the business outcome. Through self-auditing, a number of organizations have discovered patterns like this in the assignment of performance ratings that favored a particular group and might indicate a potential bias. Ernst & Young, the large accounting and consulting firm, is one example. A number of years ago, they uncovered what was an unexpected skewing of performance appraisal results, where males were receiving a disproportional percentage of the higher level ratings. However, by including information on unconscious bias in their subsequent management trainings on how to conduct appraisals, the company was able to reduce what appeared to be the patterns of bias based on gender. For the human resources business partners or the senior leaders and managers, the task is to call these apparent patterns to the manager's or supervisor's attention and provide non-judgmental coaching to ensure that consistent criteria are being applied in decision making. Training initiatives can also be used, as they were at E&Y, with a really best practice being to integrate awareness and things about unconscious bias, about making the decisions more inclusive, into training guidelines for the process itself. So rather than just having separately diversity training, when you train for making the employment decision, the promotion decision, include information and tips for maintaining an unbiased decision-making stance in making these decisions in the training for those processes. So in the same way that biases can affect hiring and assessment, it also is tied up in other kinds of talent discussions and decisions. Some of these are special projects or development opportunities, promotion, or who's going to succeed into key positions in the organization, which could be leadership or technical roles. Some organizations have very formal, what they call talent review discussions or sessions, and others use a more informal process, which may be the case in your library. But unless there are data and discussion points about diversity and inclusion that are part of the process, the talk and the decision making can easily turn on which employees the decision makers like, usually those who are most like themselves and with whom they feel most comfortable. So talent discussions may be about what employees should get these special assignments, or who should be first up for a key development experience, for example, going to an external course, or who is entitled to that promotion. But they also extend to creating lists of individuals who may be ready to move on into these key leadership or technical positions. And we do refer to that often as succession planning. So what can we do to mitigate the biases that creep into all of these processes? Well, there's actually two ways or two levels that we can address this at. One is at the individual level of leader and employee behaviors, and the other is at the organizational level, where we can change policies and practices. Now, obviously, these two things are not mutually exclusive. Rather, they're very interdependent. If people begin to think and act differently, they will influence the systems, and changes to the systems can help spur changes in behavior. You have to have both. A lot of organizations start out focusing on the individual side, and they do this through training. And there are clearly some benefits to doing this, but if the systems changes don't occur concurrently, any behavior changes that are motivated by the training will be difficult to sustain. Our focus today is on the organization level of change, but let's take a quick look at some of the more behavioral solutions before we move on. So here's a couple ways that we can approach changing individual behaviors. First of all, role modeling by leadership. Often when training is initiated in an organization, the last people, and sometimes the people who never are trained, are leadership. But really, they need to be the first people who are made aware, who begin to gain that cultural competence, because they are so much in a visible lens of everyone else in the organization, and they represent the organization's commitment to diversity and inclusion. So role modeling, first and foremost, by leadership is important in terms of changing the behaviors of others in the organization. And that can be done for everyone in the organization through increasing awareness and providing skill training. So it's not just knowing that I have unconscious bias, but it's knowing what I can do about that. And we'll talk about that before I finish this presentation. Coaching is also, has to be, part of the equation. It doesn't work just to send someone off to training and then not help them apply that training to their everyday challenges. So managers need to become better at coaching, especially in these areas of inclusion and bias. And some skills required for that, and also that the manager has the cultural competence to spot when there's an issue and know how to speak to the employee about it. Another thing that we can do to increase inclusion in terms of individual behaviors is just to provide more exposure to diversity. And this can be done through assigning people to cross-functional or maybe cross-locational teams. So for example, if there's something going on within the network across different libraries, just allowing someone to work with people who are from a different city or town which may have a different culture will increase individuals' understanding of diversity and make them look at differences in a different way. Also, volunteer events in our diverse communities are a wonderful opportunity for people to experience different cultures and to appreciate the different issues and strengths of the communities that surround libraries. Rotational assignments are another possibility. They may even be possible across your network. I don't know what kinds of staffing exchanges go on, but it's always something to think about. And then also recruitment events. Many corporations and for-profit organizations use recruitment as an opportunity to send people out into what often is a very targeted diversity event so that they can meet people who are perhaps from a different racial ethnic background and understand the quality of talent that's out there to be recruited. What works really well is to send both those who are managers, who often are from the dominant group in the organization, but also send those who are have the same affinity as those who are at the recruitment event. That way, individuals see that top management is concerned about diversity and inclusion and wants to get to know them, but they also can see that there are individuals like them in the organization. And then finally, a way that we can build skill in general for everyone in the organization is to find those opportunities to have frank dialogue on tough topics. Now, this needs to be facilitated, and it's a kind of training, but it really is just an opportunity for creating a safe space in which people can talk about the kinds of things that they might talk about at the water cooler, but where there might not be much guidance as to how the differences that they bring to the workplace can be orchestrated to form a conversation that is respectful and produces learning and understanding in a way of creating intercultural competence. Finally, a point that I'm going to make from here to the end of the presentation is that the necessity of building accountability for inclusive behaviors into performance assessments. And that can be done both for managers and employees, because if we make the how of getting those tasks done that were assigned each year, and we make that how include using inclusive behaviors, and then we check up on that through performance appraisal, it can make a real difference in whether the behaviors that may be being learned in training actually get implemented. So now let's take a look at changing the processes and some ideas and tips for several of the different processes that we've already talked about. But first, in terms of recruitment and sourcing, expanding the sources of candidates is really key. And one of the ways to do this is to develop a relationship with those sources that can provide diversity. What some of you, if you're involved in recruitment, may have found is that you may know of a good place to recruit diversity from, but if you just pop in at the moment that you need a candidate, often that isn't going to produce anything. What we need to do is to establish relationships with you in your particular profession. It might be with some of the ethnic caucuses. It might be with the urban league in your area. It might be with libraries who are in different parts of your county. And have those be ongoing relationships. And obviously sharing of talents and skills across your libraries. And then when you need help on finding someone, that or other organization is going to be there for you. Also, it is possible to acquire diverse slates, and I don't know if it's something any of your libraries have thought about or may have implemented. And you can do that inside in terms of when there is a position open and you're recruiting internally, but you can also, if you use outside recruiters, require them to provide diverse slates. And what diverse slates means in your organization, you need to define. Some organizations say it's one person of color, one woman on each slate. And that depends on what you think is feasible. In my experience, The worst thing we can do is set targets that are really not achievable, because that's very discouraging. And it's also a process and a sense of readiness. So whatever you think that the organization is capable of doing as a next step is a good way to set some goals if it's going to be around diverse slates. Also, and it can produce some really interesting and helpful results, you can track the results from each phase of the hiring process, because often we don't know where the diversity is diminishing. So if you take a look at what kind of diversity you have in that initial submission of resumes, and then after they're screened, you see what you have left, and then after you do an initial round of interviews, you keep count of what the diversity is left in that pool. And then finally, after you achieve the hiring, where have you wound up in terms of having hired one of those diverse candidates? And you take a look at that, you can see where the diversity may be diminishing, and then you can look at that particular process. So is it the way we're screening our resumes? Coming back to that example where the names were creating the issue, some companies are now taking the names off the resume so that any racial ethnic identification that might be indicated won't be visible to those screeners. Or is it in what we're looking for in the resumes that creates that round of candidates to be interviewed? And that kind of takes us back to thinking about what's in the job description and what's in the qualifications in the recruitment notice. Are we asking perhaps for some qualifications which really aren't required to do this job, but perhaps the last couple of people who were incumbents had those qualifications, and now we think that, for example, a master's level degree is required, when in actuality, if we look back at the tasks that need to be done, they can be accomplished by someone who has maybe only a 4-year degree, or maybe perhaps for some jobs they don't need to be degreed, and we really need to look at the kind of experience and skills that the individual has. So very important to look at each phase in the process so we can decide where do we need to do something here. Because thinking about the last phase, just when the hiring is actually taking place, I have had many people who are in recruitment functions tell me, well, we always provide a diverse candidate slate, but what we see happening is the manager rarely chooses someone who is a woman or a person of color. So then we need to work on what's going on with regard to how managers are making those final decisions. And if they understand the benefits of when candidates are equal, and of course there's never a completely equal in hiring, but have more or less the same qualifications, what might someone who comes from a different background bring to the organization to benefit us? And you can think of it, not as hiring necessarily the diversity of the individual's racial, ethnic, or gender contribution, but of the ideas that come with that. So I've just covered the whole idea about looking for that bias in job descriptions and competencies, which might have been pointed out by tracking the hiring process itself, but you can also go in and just do that even if you're not in a hiring mode. And there's some really interesting tools that are out there right now, and some of you may have heard of them, that can help you with the gender bias issue. There's one, and you can just Google this, called Textio. That's spelled Textio. There's another one called Gender Decoder. And both of these, if you feed your job description or your job ad through them, will point out to you what may be gender-biased language in the description. So you might want to just try that and see what you get. You may not feel that everything that it's pointing out is gender-biased, but it's kind of eye-opening. So look for Textio and Gender Decoder. Also, we talked about being aware of decisions based on fit, and there's a couple of ways that you can avoid this. One is the things we've already talked about being as objective as possible in describing the job, but then as objective as possible also in how we're assessing the candidates. And that can be using multiple rating sources, and by that I mean you may use some sort of online assessment or an external person to do an assessment, or at least use multiple people to interview internally, either as a panel or individually. And those people themselves obviously need to represent some diversity within your library. So often it's helpful even to have people who are not necessarily in the same job, team, or group. I heard from, it was the airport in Miami, that in order to increase diversity there, they want to make sure they always have panels that have diversity. So they go outside of the functional area of the person being hired and look for additional diversity on their hiring panels, whether or not the individual is in that same function. You can also, as we mentioned, self-audit those performance appraisal patterns and coach managers to spot them. And then, finally, include diversity in all talent development and succession discussions and track some diversity metrics. And I'm going to go into that just a little bit more here on the next slide. So there are some specific things that you can ask as those discussions are going on that help pinpoint where there might be bias, and we might be overlooking the fact that the system, the process, is not working the same for everyone. And keeping some data on this obviously is very helpful, since we can be objective about what might be going on. So in terms of 3 different areas that I have listed here, diversity of talent, it's helpful to ask, what do the talent demographics tell us about the diversity of the pool? Most importantly, how is it distributed, and what are the trends, and how we're changing the mix in each of the different job groups or levels within the organization? That will tell us in turn, where do we need to do some work on hiring, or alternatively on advancement. And it's always important to look in both directions. Many organizations have an idea of whether they like to be internal in terms of most of their promotions or external. But often it takes both to increase the diversity, so we want to consider both. And then the diversity data, for example, if we look at who's leaving and who's staying, can also tell us something about retention. And if we think back to the very beginning of this presentation, we know that whether or not people are engaged, which has to do with how included they feel, is going to affect retention. So if we see higher rates of leaving among certain groups, we need to begin to explore what might be going on in terms of their experiences in the workplace and what we might do about that in order to increase that retention and keep them in our talent pool. When it comes to development, a couple additional questions can be asked. Are diverse candidates receiving the same development? And are they progressing at the same rate as others? Does it take longer for somebody to move from an assistant position to a senior position if they're a person of color? And what might that tell us? Are those identified as having potential all get mentoring equally? And do they all have formal development plans, and are these plans being implemented? Again, that gets us to accountability. Finally, around promotions and succession, or who are going to be the future leaders of the organization, do we have diversity in the candidate list for those promotions and the replacement of individuals in key roles? And have we considered all the possible internal candidates for these critical open positions? Because often that's a place where we turn externally. And as I mentioned when I was talking about what's in the job descriptions, are we unnecessarily limiting the talent that can come into that position by how we've defined the criteria for who can do that job? And are some of those perhaps not essential? So what I would suggest is that you can keep metrics in each one of these areas, and those metrics then become the basis for an objective discussion of how are we doing at getting both diversity and creating inclusion. And I can't stress enough this final item on this page, which is who is accountable for the actions that are required to create the change. So most likely what you need to do is start building into the accountability, first of all, of leadership, and then of next level managers for what they're doing, not only to hire diversity, but to orient individuals who are coming into the organization to ensure that people are engaged. If you do some surveys or focus groups about that, and what's going on with retention for each one of the key areas that are managed by someone within your organization, and make that part of that individual's responsibility and their performance appraisal. And you can also slip in inclusive behaviors as part of the performance appraisal for everyone in the organization, so that everything is working toward creating that inclusive environment that people want to come to work, want to stay at, and want to recommend to their friends. A couple more before we wind up. And I know I want to leave a couple of minutes for questions here. But other organizational actions that you might think about that are outside of the talent management piece but do support it are ensuring policies are in place on non-discrimination, harassment, and expectations for respectful behavior, and that they are being consistently enforced. Also designing flexible work, benefit, and other policies that will fit the needs of a diverse workplace. Seeking feedback from employees on a regular basis, and I have mentioned that several times during our time together. Holding managers accountable for considering diversity and inclusion in their talent management. And then finally, a brief word about individual actions that we can take. Remember I said it's not enough to be aware of your unconscious biases, but what do you do about them, especially when you're making people decisions? First of all, you need to be conscious of them. And that means maybe you want to take an assessment. Some of you may have heard of the implicit bias association test. It's called the IAT, Implicit Association Test. And that helps you spot some of your biases. There are other assessments out there. And you can also ask for some feedback. Ask yourself in general when you're about to make a decision about someone, does a person remind you of yourself in any way? So might you be biased because they are like you? Does a person remind you of someone you know? And could that affect you positively or negatively? And then are there things that you've learned about the person, maybe from someone else, that are particularly influencing your impression or your judgment? And then ask yourself a second question, are they relevant to the decision that you're actually making? And then finally, have you already made judgments about the person? Remember we said that in the first 7 seconds you can make 11 judgments, and those are there. And if so, are they grounded in facts, or are you relying on assumptions or interpretations? So I wanted you to have just these individual points, even though we've been talking about processes and practices throughout most of our presentation today. So let's wrap up, and then we'll take some questions. So the path to inclusion through talent management means, on the people side, building inclusion awareness and skills that increase cultural competencies that allows people to make decisions that are made inclusively. And then on the process side, defining behaviors and competencies that reflect inclusion thinking and funneling those into the way that you make decisions about hiring. And then also about your internal talent by identifying a diverse pool of future leaders through inclusive assessments. Supporting the development of everyone in the organization, including creating alternative career paths and making sure that work-life needs are attended to through policies and practices. And then using formal processes to make diversity and inclusion part of all talent discussions, and as you attempt to diversify the succession slates for key positions in the organization. And for both of these pathways, holding the leaders accountable. So I hope some of this information has been ringing true for you. I see that I have a couple additional comments over here. I would just challenge each of you to challenge yourself and challenge the process. So let me take a look here at the questions that we have. Let's see. Has anyone typed in something that I should be taking a look at, Aaron? Or can we ask them to do that?
I do not see any questions, but they're welcome to type in their questions.
That seems like a good message from Aaron. Always nice to get credit, right? And Emily is typing something. I don't know yet whether it is... Ah, it was thank you. And thank you, Emily, for participating. Well, if you have any additional questions, my email is right there on this slide and my phone number. And I'm always happy to talk to people about diversity and inclusion. And then can I plug my webinar or my actual in-person workshop one more time, Erin? I hope that I meet some of you next month in Fort Myers when I come to do 2 different workshops. And one of those will be on unconscious bias. And one will be more toward the idea of how do we have those difficult conversations in the workplace.
All right. Well, thank you, Mary, for a wonderful webinar. Some information and a sneak peek of what is coming up. Attendees, I echo Mary's comments. If you enjoyed this webinar, please join us for a full day workshop. There'll be 2 different sections to it on Thursday, August 17th, where Mary will be discussing developing cultural competence, new ways to see the world. We will encourage you to look at the upcoming webinars and workshops in months ahead and hope you're all able to join us for future training opportunities. As always, please feel free to keep checking the Swiftland CE calendar on the website, the Swiftland Facebook page, or look for your message from the various listservs. Thank you everyone for attending and have a terrific weekend.
And thank you to our interpreter.
Yes, thank you.